Young millionaire married a poor girl to escape an arranged marriage, but her secret shocked him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. The chandeliers of the Blackwell Grand Hotel sparkled like frozen stars. Cameras flashed in every direction. Guests in designer gowns and tuxedos whispered behind champagne glasses. A wedding of the year, they called it. The heir to the Blackwell fortune, one of the youngest millionaires in New York, was getting married. Yet the murmurs weren't about his success. They were about her. The bride didn't belong. That much was obvious. She stepped onto the aisle in a borrowed white dress that barely fit her frame, her hands trembling as she clutched a bouquet of lilies that looked too heavy for her. Whispers rippled through the room. Who is she? She's not from any family we know. She looks like she came straight out of the service staff. At the altar, Adrian Blackwell stood tall, jaw set, eyes cold, the very image of power. But inside, his mind was a storm. He wasn't marrying her out of love. He was marrying her to end the suffocating grip of his family's plans, an arranged marriage with a woman he didn't choose. This poor girl, plucked from the margins of his world, was his escape. She met his eyes for a second. They were steady, unflinching. He expected fear. He expected pleading. Instead, her gaze held something else. Something he couldn't read. The vows were spoken. The kiss was swift, awkward. The applause polite, but laced with venom. Cameras clicked like gunshots. She flinched, but raised her chin, refusing to bow her head. For the first time that night, Adrian noticed. At the reception, waiters moved like shadows, carrying silver trays. She sat at his side, a stranger in lace, hands folded neatly in her lap. A glass of red wine trembled in her grip. Then it slipped. The crimson liquid cascaded across the table, splattering the gown of Mrs. Kensington, one of the most influential women in the room. Gasps. A sharp intake of breath. Mrs. Kensington froze, her lips curving into a cruel smile. How clumsy. The room chuckled, some not even bothering to hide it. Adrian's jaw tightened. He leaned closer, his voice low, sharp. Do you realize what you've just done? She swallowed hard, meeting his glare. Her voice was quiet, but steady. I spilled wine, not blood. They'll survive. The corner of his mouth twitched, not with amusement, but with something else. Defiance. He wasn't used to it. Not from board members. Not from rivals. And certainly not from her. The whispers grew louder, circling the room like vultures. She's unfit. She'll ruin him. This marriage is a disgrace. And yet, while the world laughed, she straightened her shoulders. She reached for another glass, poured it calmly, and lifted it high. Her voice rang clear, echoing off marble walls. To new beginnings, she said, eyes fixed on Adrian. Even when no one believes in them. The laughter died. The room stilled. For a single breath, all eyes turned not to Adrian, but to her. And in that silence, Adrian felt the ground shift beneath him. He had married her to defy his family. But now, he wasn't so sure who was defying who. The reception dragged on like a stage play he never auditioned for. Adrian Blackwell sat rigid at the head table, shoulders squared beneath his tailored black suit. His hand loosely gripping a glass of champagne he had no intention of drinking. His new wife Evelyn sat beside him, quiet but not small. Her posture was steady, her chin lifted just enough to signal she wasn't about to break. Every so often, Adrian caught himself glancing at her, noticing the tiny tremor in her fingers as she touched the stem of her glass, the faint crease in her brow whenever the whispers grew too loud, the way she met every pair of mocking eyes with a calmness he couldn't understand. Across the ballroom, Adrian's mother stood in a cluster of women whose diamonds sparkled brighter than the chandeliers. Her expression was carved from ice. "This charade won't last," she murmured, loud enough for Evelyn to hear as she passed near their table. Evelyn didn't flinch. She turned, looked the woman in the eye, and replied softly, "No charade lasts forever." some become reality. Then she returned to her seat, leaving a stunned silence behind her. Adrian's pen nearly cracked between his fingers. He wasn't sure if he should be furious at her boldness or impressed. As the music swelled and guests began to dance, Adrian leaned closer. His voice was low, clipped. "You're not here to play games." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Neither are you. Isn't that why you married me?" The orchestra shifted into a waltz. Couples moved gracefully onto the dance floor. Adrian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble. He held out his hand to her, a move that was more command than invitation. "Dance with me." Her hesitation was brief. She placed her hand in his, and for the first time since the ceremony began, they stood as a pair. The room fell into a hush as the Blackwell heir led his poor bride onto the gleaming floor. He expected her to stumble, to falter under the eyes that dissected her every move. But Evelyn's steps, though cautious, found the rhythm. She moved with surprising grace, her dress catching the light like it belonged there. "You've done this before," Adrian muttered, eyes locked on hers. Her reply was calm, unflinching. "Dancing doesn't require wealth. Only balance." The comment disarmed him more than it should have. For a moment, he forgot the guests, forgot the game he had set in motion. There was only the pressure of her hand against his, and the strange steadiness in her gaze. When the song ended, applause rippled through the hall. Some genuine, some forced. Evelyn curtsied lightly. Adrian bowed, and for one fragile second, it felt as though the performance had shifted into something real. But reality came crashing back quickly. A man in a gray suit approached, his smile too polished to be sincere. He extended his hand to Adrian. "Congratulations, Mr. Blackwell. Though I must say, your choice surprised us all." Adrian's jaw tightened. Before he could respond, Evelyn stepped forward. Her handshake was firm, her voice clear. "Life is full of surprises, Mr. Grant. That's why we live it, not script it." The man blinked, caught off guard. He laughed politely, retreating with less confidence than he had arrived. Adrian stared at her. This wasn't the meek girl he thought he had plucked from obscurity. She was composed, even daring. He didn't like surprises, and yet he couldn't look away. Hours later, when the last glass was cleared and the last guest departed, the Blackwell mansion loomed over them like a fortress. Adrian escorted her inside, footsteps echoing against marble floors. The air was thick with silence. "This is your room," he said, opening a grand door to a suite larger than most apartments. His tone was cold, transactional. "You'll stay here. We keep up appearances, nothing more." "No." Evelyn stepped inside, eyes scanning the gilded mirrors, the canopy bed, the curtains heavy as armor. She turned back to him, her voice steady. "Appearances are easy, Adrian. What's harder is truth." He froze. Just for a second. Then he shut the door, leaving her alone in a world of velvet and gold. But that night, lying awake in his own room, Adrian found her words looping in his mind. Truth. She spoke of it like a weapon. And for the first time, he wondered what truth was she hiding. The first morning of marriage was supposed to feel different. At least, that's what the tabloids would write. But when Adrian Blackwell pushed open the dining room doors, the air felt the same sterile, silent, controlled. Only one thing stood out. Evelyn was already there. She sat at the long mahogany table, a plate of untouched eggs in front of her. She wasn't staring at the food. She was reading a thick, leather-bound book she had pulled from the Blackwell library, her lips moving faintly as though she was whispering the words to herself. Adrian paused in the doorway. For some reason, the sight unsettled him. He expected her to be dazzled, overwhelmed, maybe even frightened. Instead, she looked oddly at ease, surrounded by chandeliers and silver cutlery she clearly had never known before. "Most people don't read at breakfast," he said dryly, walking to his seat at the head of the table. Evelyn closed the book gently, marking the page with her finger. "Most people don't marry strangers either." "But here we are." His jaw clenched. He hated how quickly she found ways to pierce through his armor. He poured coffee into his cup, ignoring her, but the silence that followed pressed on him harder than any conversation. Finally, he asked, "Why that book?" Her eyes flicked down to the cover. "Blackwell Holdings, A History of Deals and Partnerships." I figured if I'm going to be paraded as your wife, I should at least know what empire I'm standing next to. Adrian's hand froze midair. He hadn't expected that answer. And what did you learn? That your family values appearances more than honesty, she replied, her voice calm, almost too calm. For a moment, the only sound was the faint clink of his spoon against the porcelain. The door opened. His mother swept in like a shadow draped in pearls. Adrian, she said coolly, then turned to Evelyn. I trust you slept. Comfortably. Evelyn stood, polite but not meek. Very. Thank you for asking. The older woman's lips curved in a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Enjoy it while it lasts. She placed a hand on Adrian's shoulder. We'll discuss the merger later, alone. Then she glided out, her perfume lingering like smoke. Evelyn sat back down, her face expressionless. Adrian noticed her grip on the book tighten for just a second. She didn't speak, but he could read her silence like ink. She wasn't here to be broken. Later that afternoon, they were expected at a charity luncheon. It was another stage for appearances, another opportunity for society to judge. Evelyn wore a simple navy dress that had been altered hastily by a stylist. She walked into the ballroom with Adrian at her side, her steps measured, her gaze steady. Almost immediately, the whispers began. She's nothing but a prop, a poor girl in borrowed silk. This won't last a month. Adrian felt his stomach twist, but he kept his expression carved from stone. He told himself he didn't care what they said about her. This was his choice, his game. Yet every cruel whisper seemed to cut closer to him than it should. The luncheon began with speeches. Adrian barely listened until Evelyn stood. She wasn't supposed to. No one had asked her to speak. But there she was, lifting her glass with quiet confidence. I'm honored to be here, she said, her voice clear across the crowded hall. When I look around this room, I see power, wealth, influence. But none of that matters if it isn't used to lift others. True legacy isn't built on numbers in a bank account. It's built on lives changed. The room fell still. Adrian's chest tightened. She wasn't just reciting empty words. She meant them. He could hear it in the way her voice trembled slightly, but never broke. When she sat down, the silence lingered longer than expected. Then came a smattering of applause, awkward at first, then stronger. Adrian's mother's face was pale with fury. Adrian leaned close, his voice a low growl. What was that? Evelyn didn't look at him. The truth. And in that moment, as the applause echoed in his ears, Adrian realized something he hadn't planned for. He had brought Evelyn into his life as an escape. But with every word, every act of defiance, she was becoming something else, something he couldn't control. And control was the one thing Adrian Blackwell never let slip. The Blackwell limousine glided through the streets of Manhattan that evening, its tinted windows cutting them off from the flashing cameras outside. Adrian sat stiff in his corner, his tie loosened but his eyes sharp, watching Evelyn from the reflection on the glass. She was quiet, staring out at the city lights, as if they belonged more to her than to him. Finally, he broke the silence. You embarrassed me today. Her head turned slowly. I spoke the truth. If that embarrasses you, then maybe the problem isn't me. His jaw flexed. He wasn't used to resistance, especially not from someone who was supposed to be temporary, a pawn in his rebellion against his family. Yet every word she spoke seemed to wedge itself deeper into his thoughts. They arrived at the mansion. Reporters shouted questions as the car pulled up the drive, bulbs flashing like lightning. Adrian exited first, his hand automatically extending toward her. She hesitated but took it. Together they walked past the cameras, faces composed, playing the part of a perfect couple. Once inside, Adrian dismissed the staff and closed the heavy oak doors behind them. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. Evelyn stepped out of her heels, leaving them by the door as though she had done it 1,000 times before. You act like you belong here, he muttered. She looked at him, steady and calm. Maybe because I don't need marble floors to know my worth. Oh. Her words stung more than he cared to admit. He turned away, pouring himself a drink. The amber liquid caught the chandelier's light. This isn't a fairy tale, Evelyn. You were supposed to smile, nod, and disappear into the background. And yet, she replied softly, you keep noticing me. His hand froze on the glass. For a moment, their eyes locked his stormy, hers unyielding. Something unspoken pulsed between them. Fragile, but undeniable. The next morning, Adrian had an early meeting with potential investors. Evelyn, though not invited, found herself seated at the far end of the conference table, a silent observer. The men in suits exchanged polite smiles, but she could see it, the glances, the smirks, the unspoken doubt about her presence. One of them finally voiced it. "Mr. Blackwell, surely your bride has more entertaining places to be than a boardroom." The table chuckled. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, but Evelyn's voice cut through the laughter before he could. "If this room is where decisions are made, then perhaps it's the most entertaining place of all." The chuckles stopped. Adrian turned his head slowly toward her, disbelief flashing across his face. The investor raised an eyebrow. "And what would you know about decisions at this level?" Evelyn folded her hands, unshaken. "I know that decisions without conscience eventually collapse. You measure profits, I measure people, and one without the other never lasts." The room fell silent. Even Adrian couldn't find words for a moment. He should have been furious. She had no right to speak. And yet, as he looked at the men shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, he felt something he hadn't expected: respect. When the meeting ended, Adrian walked her out, his voice sharp but quieter than usual. "Do you enjoy putting yourself in the line of fire?" Evelyn met his gaze without blinking. "Do you enjoy hiding behind silence?" His chest tightened, a flicker of something he refused to name flashing in his eyes. He wanted to push her away, to remind her that she was here only because of a contract. But instead he found himself replaying her words, the way the room had listened to her, the way he had listened. That night, alone in his study, Adrian stared at the flames in the fireplace. For the first time, the empire around him felt fragile, not because of his enemies, but because of the woman he thought would be his shield. Evelyn was supposed to be forgettable, replaceable. Instead, she was becoming unforgettable, and that terrified him. The following week began with rain, the kind that blurred Manhattan's skyline into shadows. Adrian Blackwell was scheduled to attend a charity gala at the Westwood Hotel, a stage where the elite paraded themselves under crystal chandeliers. Evelyn was expected to stand at his side, smiling, silent, ornamental. She entered the foyer just as the driver announced the car was ready. She wore a dress chosen by his mother's stylist, emerald silk draped carefully, hair pulled into soft waves. But there was something in her eyes that didn't match the perfection, a quiet defiance, a promise she wouldn't be anyone's mannequin. Adrian looked her over, expression unreadable. "Try not to start a revolution tonight," he muttered as he adjusted his cufflinks. Her lips curved slightly. No promises. The gala roared with laughter and polished speeches. Waiters weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and the scent of roses filled the air. Adrian shook hands with businessmen, posed for photographs, his face carved into the perfect smile of a man who ruled his world. Evelyn stayed close, listening, absorbing. Her silence wasn't meekness, it was calculation. Halfway through the evening, Meredith Kensington appeared, a woman born into the kind of wealth that sneered at imperfection. Her red gown clung like armor, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. She approached Adrian with an air of ownership, then turned to Evelyn with a laugh that wasn't laughter at all. "So this is the girl you married," Meredith said sweetly. "How refreshing. Tell me, Evelyn, do you even know what fork to use for the main course?" A ripple of amusement moved through the circle of guests. Adrian's jaw clenched, ready to intervene. But Evelyn beat him to it. She lifted her glass slowly, her gaze steady. "I know which fork to use," she said calmly, "but more importantly, I know which battles aren't worth fighting." She tilted her head, eyes glinting. Like petty ones at a dinner table, the group fell silent. A few smirked nervously, others looked away. Adrian caught himself holding his breath. Later, as the orchestra played, Evelyn found herself cornered by Meredith again, this time with a French investor at her side. Meredith leaned in, voice dripping with mockery. "Be careful, dear. Men in this world don't like women who speak out of turn." Evelyn's reply was soft, almost gentle. "Then perhaps it's time the world learned to listen." The investor chuckled, intrigued. Meredith's smile faltered. For the first time, Adrian saw her retreat, her power shaken not by money, but by words. When Evelyn returned to Adrian's side, he studied her carefully. She wasn't polished like the others, but she was something rarer, unshakable. He leaned close, voice low. "You're going to make enemies." Her answer was a whisper against the rim of her glass. "Only the kind worth having." The rest of the night blurred with music and speeches, but Adrian's focus never strayed far from her. He found himself drawn to the way she navigated the crowd, firm, yet graceful, refusing to bow to the rules of his world. She didn't belong here, and yet, somehow, she did. When the gala finally ended, they rode home in silence, the city lights streaking past the windows. Adrian broke it first. "You don't understand the consequences of what you're doing." Evelyn turned her face toward him, calm, unwavering. "No, Adrian. You don't understand the consequences of staying silent." The words lingered long after the car pulled into the mansion gates. That night, as Adrian lay awake, he realized the truth he had been avoiding. He had married Evelyn to escape a cage built by his family. But she wasn't just breaking his family's rules. She was breaking his. And somewhere deep inside, a dangerous thought flickered he didn't want her to stop. The morning after the gala, the Blackwell mansion felt heavier than usual. Headlines screamed from every newspaper left at the front gate photos of Evelyn in emerald silk, standing toe-to-toe with Meredith Kensington. Poor girl claps back at high society. Blackwell bride stuns at charity gala. Adrian tossed the papers onto his desk, frustration bubbling beneath his calm surface. His family hated attention that couldn't be controlled. His mother's call had already come, sharp and cold. "She's embarrassing us. End this before it destroys you." But when Adrian found Evelyn in the garden, she wasn't rattled. She was crouched by a row of roses, fingertips brushing the petals as though they were more important than the tabloids. "You've made yourself the story," Adrian said, voice clipped. She looked up at him, sunlight catching in her eyes. "Number blanks to pryling. They made me the story because I don't fit their mold. I just refuse to play along." For a moment, he didn't know how to answer. He was used to people defending themselves with excuses or silence. But Evelyn met fire with fire, and it left him unsteady. That evening, Adrian hosted a private dinner at the mansion with key investors. It was supposed to be routine, a chance to smooth nerves after the chaos of the gala. Evelyn wasn't expected to join, but she appeared anyway, in a simple navy dress that contrasted sharply with the glittering jewelry of the other guests. The whispers started immediately. Adrian saw the investors exchange glances, the skepticism etched across their faces. One of them, Mr. Calloway, finally voiced it. "Mr. Blackwell, forgive me, but your bride seems out of place at a table like this." Evelyn set down her fork gently. Her voice was calm, but every syllable cut clean. "Out of place? Or simply uninvited to a club that mistakes wealth for wisdom?" The table went quiet. Adrian's chest tightened. He expected Calloway to laugh her off, to crush her with condescension. Instead, the man cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably, suddenly more interested in his glass of wine than in challenging her. After the guests left, Adrian confronted her in the hall. "You're reckless. Do you realize one wrong word could cost me millions?" Evelyn stood tall, refusing to be dwarfed by his anger. "And what would millions matter if you can't look yourself in the mirror?" "I'm not here to be silent, Adrian. I never agreed to that." His fists clenched at his sides, but anger wasn't what he felt most. It was something closer to fear, fear of how much he couldn't control her and how much he didn't want to. Later that night, alone in his study, Adrian replayed her words. He remembered the way Calloway had looked at her, not as an outsider, but as someone who had struck a chord he couldn't ignore. For the first time, Adrian wondered if Evelyn wasn't just surviving his world, maybe she was reshaping it. And that terrified him more than any boardroom battle ever had. The next morning began with tension hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Adrian had left early for meetings, but Evelyn could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her. The staff treated her politely, yet their glances lingered too long, filled with silent judgment. She wasn't just a stranger here, she was an intruder in a world that didn't want her. By noon, Adrian returned. His expression was tight, his tie loosened as if even fabric couldn't restrain his frustration. "Pack a dress," he said flatly. "There's a luncheon with the board this afternoon. You're coming." Evelyn set her book aside, her brow arching. "I thought I wasn't supposed to speak in those meetings." "You're not," he snapped. But you'll be there. Optics matter. The Blackwell Tower's boardroom gleamed with glass and steel, high above Manhattan. Executives in tailored suits filled the long table, their pens clicking, their eyes calculating. Evelyn sat beside Adrian, silent but observant. The meeting dragged through charts and projections until one executive, a man with graying hair and a smug smile, glanced at her. "Forgive me, Mr. Blackwell, but I can't help wondering, does she really belong at this table? Surely her perspective isn't relevant to matters of this scale." A few chuckles followed, sharp and cruel. Adrian's jaw tightened, but before he could reply, Evelyn's voice carried across the polished wood. "Perspective is always relevant," she said calmly, "especially when it isn't bought." The room froze. Pens stopped clicking. The man flushed, his smile faltering. Adrian felt every eye shift between him and his wife, waiting for him to silence her. But he didn't. For reasons he couldn't explain, he let the silence linger, let her words sink in. When the meeting ended, the executives left in subdued clusters, whispering among themselves. Adrian walked Evelyn out, his voice low and sharp. "You can't keep doing this." She met his eyes, unflinching. "You mean telling the truth?" "I mean undermining me in front of my board," he shot back. Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "Funny, I thought I was supporting you. They weren't laughing when I finished." He hated that she was right. He hated even more that a part of him felt proud. That evening, a storm rolled across the city, lightning flashing against the tall windows of the mansion. Adrian stood by the fireplace in his study, drink in hand, when Evelyn entered. She wasn't dressed for confrontation, just a simple cardigan over a plain dress, but the moment she spoke, it felt like a challenge. "You live surrounded by walls," she said softly. "Glass, steel, gold. But they're still walls. Don't you ever get tired of it?" Adrian turned sharply, his voice colder than the rain against the glass. "You don't know what it's like to have an empire balanced on your shoulders. Every word, every move judged. You couldn't possibly understand." "Oh." Evelyn stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "You're right. I don't have an empire. But I know what it's like to carry the weight of survival, to make choices when none of them are fair. Don't talk to me about judgment, Adrian. I've lived with it my whole life." The fire cracked, filling the silence between them. For the first time, Adrian didn't see her as a nuisance or a pawn. He saw her as someone who carried scars invisible to the glittering world around them. Their eyes held, the storm outside echoing the storm within. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. And in that moment, Adrian Blackwell realized something dangerous. He wasn't just respecting Evelyn. He was beginning to need her. The storm broke overnight, leaving the city washed in silver light. By morning, the mansion smelled faintly of rain, soaked earth drifting in from the gardens. Evelyn rose early, slipping into the kitchen, where the staff usually prepared Adrian's rigid breakfast routine. Today, though, she asked them to step aside. When Adrian finally came down, expecting his usual black coffee and half toast, he found her at the stove, sleeves rolled up, hair loosely tied, flipping pancakes onto a plate. The sight froze him in the doorway. "I didn't realize you'd replace the staff," he said dryly. "I didn't," Evelyn replied without looking at him. "But sometimes it's nice when food comes with intention, not obligation." She set the plate in front of him. "Sit. You might even like it." Against his instincts, Adrian sat. The pancakes weren't perfect, edges uneven, syrup dripped over the plate, but they smelled warm, real. He took a bite, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, breakfast didn't taste like routine. It tasted like something that had been made for him, not scheduled into his day. Evelyn poured herself coffee and sat across from him, calm and unhurried. "Your empire won't collapse if you eat something imperfect," she teased. For a moment, his lips threatened a smile, but he caught himself, covering it with a sip of coffee. Still, the warmth lingered longer than he wanted to admit. Later that afternoon, they attended a fundraising committee meeting at a luxury hotel downtown. Adrian had planned to keep Evelyn at the edge of the crowd, where her presence was tolerated but not scrutinized. Yet halfway through, a microphone was passed unexpectedly to her. "Mrs. Blackwell," the host said, his smile too rehearsed, "perhaps you'd like to share a few words about your perspective?" It was meant as a jab, a polite humiliation in front of donors who already doubted her. Adrian's chest tightened, preparing to step in, But Evelyn accepted the mic with steady hands. "I grew up in a neighborhood where fundraising meant passing a hat at church to keep the lights on," she began. "So when I see millions promised for causes, I ask myself one thing: will it change lives or just add names to plaques? Real charity doesn't need chandeliers and champagne. It needs courage." The room fell quiet. Her words weren't polished, but they were raw, undeniable. Adrian scanned the faces around them. Some stunned, some uncomfortable, a few deeply moved. When she handed back the mic, whispers spread across the hall, but they weren't the same whispers of mockery he'd grown used to hearing. This time, there was curiosity. Respect. Back in the car, Adrian broke the silence first. "You just questioned the entire system in front of its architects." Evelyn's gaze stayed on the city rushing past the window. "Maybe it's time someone did." His hand tightened around the leather armrest, not from anger, but from something sharper. Every time she spoke, she chipped away at the fortress he had built, exposing cracks he didn't know existed. That evening, back at the mansion, he found her in the library, scanning titles as if searching for pieces of a puzzle. She pulled out a thick volume on contract law, flipping through pages with the ease of someone who wasn't just curious, someone who understood. "You've read that before," he said, stepping into the room. She glanced at him, calm. 3 years of law school before life got in the way. "I didn't graduate, but the knowledge didn't disappear." Adrian's breath caught for a second. Pieces clicked into place the way she spoke with precision, the way she dismantled arguments effortlessly. She wasn't just sharp. She had been trained for a world not so different from his, until circumstance tore it from her. "You kept that from me," he said quietly. Evelyn slid the book back onto the shelf. "You never asked." "Oh." Their eyes met, heavy with something unspoken. For the first time, Adrian realized the truth. He had been circling around for weeks. She wasn't just surviving his world. She might know how to navigate it better than most of the people in it. And that truth unsettled him more than anything else. The following days unfolded with a strange rhythm inside the Blackwell mansion. For the first time, Adrian caught himself listening when Evelyn spoke. Even when her words weren't meant for him. She asked sharp questions during dinners with partners, and she carried herself with a quiet strength that unsettled the people around her. But one night, when the staff had retired and the halls fell silent, he found her on the balcony outside the library. She leaned against the railing, the city light stretching endlessly below. Her arms were wrapped around herself, not from cold, but from the weight of something heavier. "You read contracts like they're novels," Adrian said, stepping out to join her. "You didn't just dabble in law, did you?" Evelyn didn't turn, her voice low but steady. "I was 1 semester away from graduating. Then my father died. My mother couldn't hold the house together. Rent didn't wait for grief. School became a luxury I couldn't afford." Adrian froze, the glass of whiskey in his hand, suddenly heavy. She finally turned to him, eyes reflecting both the city lights and the memories she couldn't erase. "I worked whatever jobs I could, waitressing, cleaning, anything that kept the lights on for me and my little brother." Her lips pressed together, trembling only for a moment before she steadied herself. "Every night, I promised him I'd find a way back. But promises don't always pay the bills." For a long moment, Adrian said nothing. He had built his empire on contracts and mergers, but here was a woman who had built her survival on grit and sacrifice. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally. Her gaze hardened. "Because you didn't want to know. You wanted a wife who stayed quiet and looked pretty at galas. That's not me." The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the city below. Adrian found himself staring at her differently, not as an inconvenience, not even as a challenge, but as someone who had fought battles invisible to his world. The next evening, they attended a dinner hosted by one of his oldest rivals, Victor Lang. Lang had built his fortune on charm and deceit, and he welcomed them with a smile too wide to be genuine. "Adrian," Lang said smoothly, "and the famous Evelyn. You've been quite the subject lately." His eyes swept over her in a way that made Adrian's fists tighten beneath the table. Throughout the night, Lang pushed subtle barbs, questioning Adrian's decisions, hinting that Evelyn was out of place. But instead of shrinking, Evelyn met every comment with calm precision. At one point, Lang leaned forward, his smirk daring. "Tell me, Mrs. Blackwell, do you really understand the world your husband rules? Or are you just borrowing his last name. Adrian tensed, ready to end the night in an explosion. But Evelyn didn't blink. She set her wineglass down and leaned forward slightly. "I understand more than you think," she said. "Empires aren't built on names, Mr. Lang. They're built on choices. And some of the worst choices are made by men who underestimate women at the table." The room fell silent. For a beat, Lang's smirk faltered. Then he laughed it off, but his eyes betrayed his discomfort. On the drive home, Adrian watched Evelyn from the corner of his eye. The city lights cast soft shadows across her face, but her expression remained unreadable. Finally, he broke the silence. "You humiliated him." She turned her head toward him, her voice calm. I reminded him that underestimating people has consequences. For the first time, Adrian didn't argue. He simply leaned back, a strange mixture of pride and unease tightening in his chest. Evelyn wasn't just defying his world. She was reshaping it, and against all odds, he was starting to let her. The fallout from Victor Lang's dinner came faster than Adrian expected. By the next morning, the financial press buzzed with speculation. Headlines questioned Evelyn's place at his side, twisting her sharp words into scandal. "Poor bride humiliates rival tycoon. Is Blackwell's marriage crumbling into chows?" Adrian sat at the breakfast table, scrolling through headlines on his tablet. His jaw was clenched, his coffee untouched. Across from him, Evelyn ate quietly, as if the noise outside these walls meant nothing. "Do you even realize what you've done?" Adrian finally asked, voice edged with frustration. Evelyn looked up calmly. "I told the truth. If the world can't handle it, that's not my problem." "Oh," he pushed the tablet across the table, screen glowing with gossip. "It is your problem. It's mine too. My family, my company, everything I've built is under attack because you can't keep your mouth shut." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Evelyn's expression hardened, her voice steady but laced with hurt. "You married me to escape their control, Adrian. And now you're upset because I won't let them control me either?" The words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He stood abruptly, leaving his coffee untouched, the tension trailing him down the hall. Later that afternoon, the Blackwell board called an emergency meeting. Adrian arrived with Evelyn at his side, though every advisor had urged him to leave her home. As soon as they entered, the whispers began. Executives shot her pointed looks, muttering beneath their breath. When the meeting began, his mother's voice was sharp, carrying across the room. "This marriage has become a liability, Adrian. Investors are nervous. Your bride is reckless. We can't afford more scandals." Adrian leaned back in his chair, expression carved from stone. But before he could answer, Evelyn spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like glass. "Maybe the real scandal isn't me," she said. "Maybe it's a system so fragile that one woman's honesty can shake it." The board erupted in murmurs. His mother's glare could have frozen fire. But Evelyn didn't flinch. When the meeting ended, Adrian walked her out in silence. The air in the corridor was heavy, thick with unspoken words. Finally, he turned to her, his voice low. "You're making enemies you don't even see." Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I've lived my whole life with enemies, Adrian. Poverty, judgment, prejudice. These people don't scare me." For a moment, he could only stare at her. He wanted to be angry, to remind her this was his world, his rules. But what unsettled him most was the truth buried in her words. She was stronger than he had ever imagined. That night, alone in his study, Adrian found himself pouring another drink he didn't need. Evelyn's voice echoed in his mind, louder than the storm of the boardroom. He had married her to defy control. Yet every day, it felt less like defiance and more like revelation. And deep inside, a thought he didn't want to face clawed its way to the surface. What if this woman he had underestimated was the only person in his world who was truly free? The next week brought no calm. Instead, it carried the storm Evelyn had unknowingly lit. The Blackwell name was everywhere, splashed across magazines, whispered on news anchors' lips, dissected at every corporate dinner table. To Adrian, it felt like the walls of his empire were closing in. To Evelyn, it was simply proof that the truth had power. The pressure came to a head at a charity gala hosted by the Kensington family. It was an event Adrian couldn't skip. Too many investors, too many eyes. As always, Evelyn walked at his side, but tonight the stares were sharper, the whispers more poisonous. Women in diamonds clutched their pearls as she passed, while men muttered about Adrian's reckless choice of bride. "Smile," Adrian whispered as cameras flashed. His arm was tight around hers. "If you give them any weakness tonight, they'll eat us alive." Evelyn turned her head slightly, her lips curving just enough to pass for a smile. "Funny," she whispered back. "I thought survival meant being yourself, not their puppet." Inside, the ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished marble floors. Meredith Kensington, radiant in crimson, approached with a smirk that never reached her eyes. "Adrian," she purred, "and Evelyn, how brave of you to show up after everything." Evelyn didn't flinch. She met Meredith's gaze head-on. "It's braver to hide, don't you think? But I've never been good at that." Meredith's smirk flickered, but she recovered quickly, looping her arm through her fiancé's. "Careful, dear. The higher you stand, the harder the fall." Adrian's grip on Evelyn's arm tightened, pulling her away before the exchange could escalate. But later, during dinner, the true blow came. A waiter, clearly coached, accidentally spilled red wine across Evelyn's lap. Gasps echoed around the table. "Oh dear," Meredith said with feigned sympathy. "How unfortunate. Perhaps silk isn't the best fabric for someone, unaccustomed to refinement." Laughter rippled. Evelyn froze for only a heartbeat, then calmly dabbed the stain with her napkin. When she looked up, her voice carried strong and clear. "I suppose refinement isn't about silk. It's about grace, and no amount of wealth can buy that." The table went silent. Adrian's chest tightened as he watched. For once, even Meredith had no quick retort. The silence stretched until the orchestra struck up a song, drowning the tension. On the ride home, the car was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Adrian broke it. "Why do you keep provoking them?" His tone was sharper than he intended, but it masked something deeper fear. Evelyn turned toward him, her stained dress still clinging to her frame, but her posture unshaken. "I'm not provoking them. I'm surviving them. The difference is, I don't bow when they tell me to." His hand curled into a fist against his knee. He hated the truth in her words. He hated how much it shook him. At the mansion, his mother was waiting in the grand hall, her eyes cold and hard. "Enough," she said, her voice slicing through the air. "This girl has dragged our name through the mud long enough. End this farce before it destroys us all." Evelyn's head lifted, her gaze steady. "A marriage isn't a farce just because you don't approve of the bride." His mother's lip curled. "Marriage? This arrangement is nothing more than Adrian's rebellion. You don't matter, girl. You never will." For the first time, Evelyn's composure cracked. Her breath caught, her shoulders tensed, but she didn't answer. Instead, she turned sharply and walked past both of them, her heels echoing across the marble floor until she disappeared down the corridor. Adrian's mother watched her leave, then fixed her gaze on him. "If you don't cut her loose, Adrian, she'll cost you everything." That night, Adrian stood outside Evelyn's door, hand hovering over the handle. He could hear the faint sound of muffled sobs, quickly silenced. His chest ached in a way he didn't recognize. He should have walked away. He should have let the distance grow. But instead, he knocked softly. There was no answer at first. Then her voice came, quiet, raw. "What do you want, Adrian?" He hesitated, then said the only truth he had. "To understand." The door cracked open. Evelyn stood there, eyes red but chin lifted. "Understand what?" "Why you keep fighting," he said. "Even when it costs you everything. Even when it breaks you." Her gaze softened, just slightly. "Because if I don't fight, Adrian, then I'm nobody. And I promised myself, after everything I lost, that I would never disappear again." For a moment, the world outside the door ceased to exist. Adrian didn't see the scandal, the board, the empire at risk. He saw only her, the fire in her eyes, the cracks in her armor, the unshakable will that refused to bend. And in that fragile silence, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't just married to her by contract anymore. He was falling for her. The morning after Evelyn's quiet confession lingered like a bruise Adrian couldn't ignore. He told himself it was business as usual meetings, calls, contracts, but every time his mind slipped, He heard her voice again. "If I don't fight, I'm nobody." At the mansion, Evelyn moved through the halls with her usual composure, but the staff noticed the difference. She wasn't just the poor girl who had married into wealth anymore, she was something else. Stronger. More dangereuse. That afternoon, Adrian hosted a press conference in the Blackwell Tower's lobby, a marble cathedral of glass and light. The purpose was simple: calm the markets, reassure investors, remind the world that Blackwell Holdings was untouchable. Evelyn wasn't supposed to be there, but she stood at his side anyway. Her presence, a quiet defiance that made headlines before the cameras even started rolling. Adrian took the podium. "Recent stories have cast doubt on my personal life, and by extension, my company. Let me be clear, Blackwell Holdings is stronger than ever. Our focus is growth, not gossip." Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked. Then one voice cut through. "Mr. Blackwell, do you regret marrying Evelyn Carter? Some say she's your biggest liability." The words sliced the room into silence. Adrian's fingers tightened around the podium. Every instinct told him to redirect, to spin, to protect the company. But before he could speak, Evelyn stepped forward. "No," she said, her voice clear, unshaken. "He doesn't regret it, and neither do I." The room erupted in whispers, flashes exploding like lightning. Evelyn met the crowd head-on. "You call me a liability because I wasn't born into this world. But maybe that's why I see it differently. Wealth without integrity isn't strength, it's weakness. If that threatens you, maybe you should be asking yourselves why." Gasps rippled across the lobby. Adrian's mother, watching from the side, went pale. For once, even Adrian was speechless. When the conference ended, they rode the elevator up in silence. Only when the doors closed did Adrian finally speak. "You just challenged half of New York's elite on live television." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. Good. Someone needed to. His chest tightened. He wanted to scold her, to remind her of the risks. But instead, what came out was softer. "You're going to destroy me, Evelyn." "One." She tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Or maybe I'll save you." That night, however, the storm Evelyn had ignited grew darker. Tabloids twisted her words, painting her as manipulative, power-hungry, reckless. On social media, hashtags trended. Number Blackwell mistake and number poor girl power. The public was divided, but the board was not. They wanted her gone. 2 nights later, Adrian attended a private dinner with top investors. He insisted Evelyn stay home, but she appeared anyway, slipping into the dining hall in a simple black dress. The room froze. One investor sneered. "This is exactly what we're talking about. She doesn't belong here." Evelyn stepped closer to the table, her voice steady. "You're right. I don't belong here. Not because I'm unworthy, but because you think worth is measured in stock prices. But let me tell you something. Empires crumble when they forget the people beneath them. And if you can't see that, then maybe you don't belong here either." The silence that followed was suffocating. Adrian stared at her, his pulse hammering in his ears. The investors shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. After the dinner, on the drive back, Adrian finally exploded. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You just told men worth billions they don't belong at their own table." Evelyn turned to him, her eyes calm but burning. Maybe that's exactly what they needed to hear. He slammed his hand against the leather seat, then fell back, his breath ragged. He was furious. But under the fury was something else, a dangerous truth he couldn't keep denying. Every word she spoke pulled him closer to her. Every act of defiance made him see what he had been missing all his life. By the time they reached the mansion, Adrian didn't head straight to his study as usual. Instead, he followed her into the hall, his voice softer than it had ever been. "Evelyn, what are you hiding from me?" Her steps faltered, just slightly. Then she turned, her expression unreadable. "Secrets don't vanish just because you finally decide to care." And with that, she walked away, leaving him standing in the silence, his chest heavy with a realization he couldn't escape. He hadn't just married her to escape his family. He was falling in love with her, and it terrified him more than any empire he had ever built. By the time autumn winds swept through Manhattan, the Blackwell mansion felt more like a battlefield than a home. The tabloids wouldn't let Evelyn breathe. Every morning, headlines screamed her name, mocking, twisting, dissecting her every move. From maid to mistress of millions? Blackwell Bride hides a dark past. Adrian tried to bury himself in work, in meetings, in contracts, but nothing drowned out the noise. The more Evelyn fought back with her quiet defiance, the louder the storm outside grew. And deep down, Adrian knew it was his fault. He had thrown her into his world as a shield, a pawn. But she had turned into something far more powerful, something he couldn't control. One evening, after a brutal day on Wall Street, Adrian returned home to find Evelyn in the library. She was curled in a leather armchair, a book in her lap, but she wasn't reading. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, her thoughts far away. "You've been hiding something from me," Adrian said quietly, leaning against the doorway. She didn't flinch. "Everyone hides something. I'm not talking about secrets from the past," he pressed, stepping closer. "I'm talking about now, about why you always seem ready for war, why you look at this house as if you're waiting for it to collapse." "No." Evelyn closed the book, her fingers lingering on the worn edges. Her voice was soft, but it carried weight. "Because I know what collapse feels like. And I promised myself I'd never let it happen again." Adrian sat across from her, his chest tight. "Then tell me what you're so afraid of." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she looked up, meeting his eyes with a vulnerability he had never seen before. "My brother." The words hung heavy in the room. Adrian leaned forward. "What about him?" "He's 17, Evelyn whispered. "Brilliant, stubborn, too much like me for his own good. He's the reason I left law school, the reason I worked every job I could find. But he's sick, Adrian. His condition requires treatments we could never afford. I kept him hidden because I knew if this family found out, they'd use him against me." Adrian's breath caught. Suddenly, everything made sense. The nights she stayed awake long after everyone slept, the way she guarded her phone like a lifeline, the fire in her eyes whenever she spoke of survival. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was rough, almost breaking. "Because you married me for convenience, not trust," she said simply. "And trust is the only currency I value." The silence between them burned hotter than the fire in the hearth. For the first time, Adrian saw the whole of her, not just the poor girl society mocked, not just the woman who defied his mother, but a sister carrying a weight heavier than any empire. Before he could answer, the sound of heels echoed across the marble hall. His mother entered, her expression sharp, her eyes narrowing as they fell on Evelyn. "So it's true," she said coldly. "You have a sick brother hidden away like some shameful secret." Evelyn stiffened, but she didn't lower her gaze. "He's not shameful. He's my family." His mother's voice was venom. "He's a liability. Do you have any idea what investors will say when they find out? That you're clinging to this marriage for money? That you'll drain us dry for him?" Adrian stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the room. "Enough." But Evelyn shook her head. Her voice, though quiet, was steady as steel. "She's right about one thing. I would give anything for him. Because love isn't a liability. It's the only thing worth fighting for." The words silenced the room. His mother's face darkened, but she didn't reply. She turned sharply and left, her heels clicking like gunshots against the floor. When she was gone, Adrian looked back at Evelyn. Her shoulders were trembling now, though she tried to hide it. He crossed the room slowly, every step heavier than the last, until he stood inches from her. "You think I can't handle the truth," he said softly. "But the truth doesn't scare me, Evelyn. Losing you does." Her breath caught, her eyes searching his for a lie. But for once, Adrian Blackwell wasn't playing games. The days that followed were chaos. Word of Evelyn's brother leaked to the press, no doubt from his mother's camp. Headlines spun it cruelly. "Blackwell Bride bleeds fortune for sick relative." Paparazzi swarmed hospitals, hunting for the boy. Investors demanded explanations. Adrian tried to control the narrative, but Evelyn faced it head-on. At a press event, she stood before cameras and spoke with a voice that carried across the nation. "My brother is not a weakness. He is my strength. Everything I've done, every sacrifice I've made, was for him. If you call that manipulation, then maybe it's time you redefined what love means." The room erupted not with laughter or scorn, but with applause. For once, the world wasn't mocking her. It was listening. Back at the mansion, Adrian found her on the balcony, the city glittering below. He stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers for the first time without calculation. "You turned their weapons into fire," he murmured. She smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "Number I just stopped hiding." And in that moment, Adrian knew the truth he had been running from since the day he married her. He didn't want her as a shield, or a pawn, or even just as a partner. He wanted her entirely, recklessly, irrevocably. But wanting her meant something he had never dared before. It meant breaking free of the world he was born into, and standing with the woman who had taught him what freedom really was. The days after Evelyn's revelation moved like a blur. The Blackwell estate was under siege, paparazzi at the gates, headlines in bold letters, whispers spilling through every corner of high society. Yet amid the chaos, something shifted between Adrian and Evelyn. He no longer saw her as an outsider dragged into his world. He saw her as the only one brave enough to face it head-on. Still, the board demanded blood. They wanted Evelyn gone. They wanted the marriage annulled, the scandal buried. Adrian was called into an emergency shareholders meeting, pressure mounting from every direction. Evelyn wasn't supposed to come, but she walked into the boardroom anyway, shoulders squared, eyes calm. Gasps rippled through the room. His mother sat at the head of the table, her lips curling into a smile. "So the liability arrives. What new embarrassment will you deliver today?" Evelyn stepped forward, her voice steady. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here to tell you what your money can't buy: dignity." Laughter erupted from some of the older men. One leaned back, smug. "And what do you know about dignity, girl? You scrubbed tables before marrying into billions." Evelyn didn't flinch. She met his gaze head-on. "Yes, I scrubbed tables. I carried trays. I worked shifts until my hands bled. And you know what I learned? That dignity isn't wearing a suit in a glass tower. It's working hard when no one thanks you. It's loving people even when the world tells you not to. That's dignity. And it's something this room could use more of." The board fell silent. Even Adrian, seated beside her, felt his throat tighten. He had given countless speeches in that very room, but none had struck so deep. His mother's voice broke the silence, cold and sharp. "This is nonsense. Our company isn't a charity case. Adrian, end this now. Prove that you're still a Blackwell." Every eye turned to him. For a moment, Adrian felt the weight of his entire empire pressing down, the years of control, expectation, duty. Then he looked at Evelyn, her steady gaze, her unshakable strength, and something inside him shifted. He stood slowly, his voice carrying across the table. "You want me to prove I'm a Blackwell? Fine. Then listen carefully. Evelyn is my wife. She is not a liability. She is not a weakness. She is the only person in this room brave enough to tell the truth. And if you think I'll discard her to protect your pride, then you've forgotten what strength really is." "Oh." The room erupted, some voices outraged, others stunned into silence. His mother's face hardened like stone, but Adrian didn't look at her. He reached for Evelyn's hand, lacing his fingers through hers for the world to see. When the meeting adjourned in chaos, the couple walked out together, cameras flashing in the lobby. For once, Adrian didn't hide. He stopped, turned to the microphones, and spoke directly to the press. "I married Evelyn because she reminded me that love and courage are worth more than money and power. I stand by her today, tomorrow, and every day after. If that costs me business, so be it. I'd rather lose deals than lose her." The words echoed across the airwaves, shaking the city, the markets, and his family name. But for Adrian, it felt like the first time he had ever spoken freely. That night, back at the mansion, Evelyn stood with him on the balcony as the city glowed below. For the first time, there were no walls between them, no contracts, no pretenses, only truth. "You just burned every bridge," she whispered. Adrian squeezed her hand. "Then I'll build new ones, with you." And for the first time since their wedding day, Evelyn let herself believe it. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Adrian had known. The empire his family built shook under the weight of scandal, but it didn't fall. Instead, something unexpected happened. For every headline mocking Evelyn, another rose defending her. For every investor who walked away, new voices rallied behind Adrian's public stand. The world had seen a different kind of Blackwell, not the ruthless young millionaire, but a man willing to risk everything for the woman he once swore was just a convenient escape. Inside the mansion, change came quietly. The staff who once whispered behind Evelyn's back now spoke to her with warmth. Neighbors who had avoided her now sought her out. But Evelyn didn't bask in the attention. She still rose early, still wrote letters to her brother, still carried herself like the girl who had fought her way through a world that told her she didn't belong. One crisp morning, Adrian found her in the garden, kneeling by the roses she'd tended since the day she arrived. She looked up when he approached, dirt smudging her fingers, sunlight catching in her hair. "Still don't act like a millionaire's wife?" he teased, though his voice carried more affection than mockery. She smiled faintly. "Good. That means I'm still me." He crouched beside her, watching her hands trace the petals. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, not heavy, not tense, but full of something new, something whole. "Evelyn," he said finally, his voice low, "I married you to escape a cage, but you turned that escape into something I didn't know I was searching for. You gave me freedom, not from my family, but from myself." Her breath caught. She turned toward him, eyes shimmering. "You don't owe me those words, Adrian. I'm not saying them because I owe you," he whispered. "I'm saying them because they're true. I don't want a contract anymore. I don't want appearances. I want us." For the first time, she saw him not as the cold CEO, not as the heir carrying an empire, but as a man stripped bare of every mask. And for the first time, she let her walls fall too. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered back, "Then you already have me." He reached for her hand, dirt-stained and calloused, and pressed it to his lips. "And you already have me." That night, Adrian hosted a small gathering, not for investors, not for the press, but for the people closest to him. He stood beside Evelyn, no longer hiding her in the shadows, no longer shielding her like a liability. He introduced her as his wife, his partner, the woman who had taught him what strength truly meant. The applause was warm, genuine. For the first time, Evelyn wasn't an outsider in his world. She was the center of it. Later, as they stood together on the balcony overlooking Manhattan, Evelyn rested her head against his shoulder. The city lights flickered like stars below, but neither of them needed the view. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Marrying me the way you did?" He turned, pressing a kiss to her hair. Because if I hadn't, I never would have found the only thing worth more than all of this." His hand swept toward the skyline. "You." Her eyes closed, a tear slipping free, but her smile was steady. For the first time in years, she wasn't surviving. She was living. And as the night wrapped around them, Adrian Blackwell, once a man trapped by duty, pride, and power, stood free, holding the woman who had shattered his world only to rebuild it stronger. Their marriage had begun as a contract, a rebellion against an arranged fate. But it ended as something far greater, two souls who had found in each other the courage to love, to fight, and to be truly free. And in the quiet of that night, their story closed, not with scandal, not with power, but with the simple, unstoppable truth of love.